I need to check the names file before writing, then craft the story. The names to avoid: Walter Hammond, Earl, Caroline, Richard, Thomas Bennett, Margaret, Daniel, Linda, Victor, Nora, Connor, Paulette, the dad, Claire, Nathan, Diane, Franklin, June, Kevin, Ashley. Now let me write the story with completely new names and the analyzed formula applied. I never expected the call to come on a Tuesday. My wife had been dead for 11 days, and I was still sleeping on her side of the bed because mine felt too wide, too quiet, too much like the rest of my life without her. 58 years old, and I didn't know how to make coffee the way she liked anymore. That's the thing nobody tells you about grief. It's not the big moments that break you. It's standing in the kitchen at 6 a.m. remembering she always added a half scoop extra, and your hand just stops. Her name was Sylvia. 31 years. We met at a gas station in Akron, Ohio, of all places. She was in a white coat. She'd just come off a nursing shift, and she was furious because the card reader wasn't working and she needed gas to get home. I offered to pay. She told me absolutely not. I paid anyway. She took my number and called me 4 days later to pay me back, and I told her to buy me dinner instead. She laughed and said I had nerve. I said I had optimism. We got married in the spring of 1994 in her mother's backyard. 22 people, a folding table, and a cake her aunt made from scratch. The happiest day of my life. She died on a Monday morning in February. Black ice on Route 77. The other driver walked away without a scratch. My wife, my Sylvia, was gone before the paramedics arrived. The officer who came to my door that morning was young, barely 30, and he looked almost as shattered as I felt. I remember thinking that it must be the worst part of his job, telling someone their whole life just ended. I don't remember the rest of that week clearly. My son Gregory flew in from Austin. My daughter-in-law handled the arrangements because I couldn't make decisions. I kept picking up my phone to call Sylvia and tell her what was happening, forgetting, and then remembering again. That loop felt like it would never stop. The call from the attorney's office came on a Tuesday, 11 days after I buried her. Her name was Ms. Hargrove. She was efficient and kind, and she asked if I could come in at my earliest convenience to go over the estate documents. I didn't think much of it. Sylvia and I had done our wills together years ago. I knew the house was mine, the savings account, the retirement fund. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. She'd worked 30 years as a registered nurse. I'd spent 26 years as a structural engineer for the county before taking early retirement 2 years ago when my knees started to go. We had a simple life. I knew exactly what we had. Or I thought I did. Ms. Hargrove had a corner office on the 4th floor of the building downtown. I sat across from her desk in a blue chair, and she placed a manila folder in front of me, and she folded her hands the way people do when they're about to tell you something they've practiced telling. She said there was a property. I said, "What property?" She said a house in Morgantown, West Virginia, purchased in 2009, in Sylvia's name alone. The mortgage had been paid off in full in 2021. The deed named a beneficiary. Not me. I sat there for what felt like a long time. I asked her to repeat that. She did. Then she slid a document across the desk, and I looked at the name on the beneficiary line. It said, Patrick Osei. I didn't know anyone named Patrick Osei. I told Miss Hargrove that. She looked at me with something careful in her eyes, and said she wasn't at liberty to speculate, but that the instructions in the estate were clear. I was to be notified, and Mr. Osei was to be contacted separately. There was a handwritten letter included, she said, sealed. My wife had written it. It was addressed to me. She placed the envelope on the folder. My name was on the front in Sylvia's handwriting, that small looping cursive I knew like my own face. I could barely look at it. I took the folder and the letter home. I sat in the car in the driveway for 45 minutes before going inside. I want to be honest about what was going through my mind, because this is the part people don't talk about, the ugliness of grief mixed with suspicion. I sat in that car, and I thought things about my wife that I'm not proud of. 31 years, and I was sitting in the driveway of the home we shared, wondering who Patrick Osei was and what Sylvia had been doing in Morgantown, West Virginia, for over a decade. I went back through memory the way you go through a drawer looking for something specific. She had traveled for work sometimes, nursing conferences, she said, 2 or 3 times a year, usually a long weekend. I never questioned it. She was a private person. That was one of the things I loved about her. She had what I used to call her interior life. She read books she never told me about. She had opinions she kept to herself until she was certain of them. I respected that. I thought I understood it. Now I sat in our driveway with a folder on my lap and a letter in my hand, and I didn't know if I understood anything at all. I opened the letter around midnight. I'd made it through dinner without reading it, made it through the news, through a phone call from Gregory, through washing the dishes and folding laundry and doing every ordinary thing I could think of to delay the moment. But midnight came and the house was quiet, and I sat at the kitchen table under the overhead light, and I opened it. Her handwriting was steady throughout. That broke something in me. She had written this knowing she would die one day, knowing I would sit somewhere alone reading it, and her hand had been steady. She started by telling me she loved me, that it was the truest thing she knew. She said she had spent 31 years grateful for the gas station and the card reader that didn't work, and the stubborn man who paid for her tank without asking. Then she told me about her brother. His name was Elijah, Sylvia's older brother, born 5 years before her in 1961. Their parents had separated when Sylvia was 3 years old, and Elijah had gone to live with their father while Sylvia stayed with their mother. The family fractured the way families did back then, quietly, completely, without explanation to the children. Sylvia said she barely remembered him, a face, a name, a feeling. She found him in 2007. She'd been doing what she called quiet searching for years. Letters to relatives, old addresses, eventually the internet. He was living in Morgantown. He'd had a hard life, 2 kids, divorced, working maintenance at a hotel, dealing with what Sylvia described carefully as years of problems he was finally getting past. She went to meet him without telling me. She wrote, "I know how that sounds. I'm sorry. I was afraid you'd want to come, and I needed to go alone first. I needed to know who he was before I brought him into our life. That's the only explanation I have, and I know it isn't enough." She went back again. And again. She paid for a lawyer to help him with a custody matter involving his youngest son. She helped him get out of an apartment complex that was slowly being condemned. She put a down payment on a small house in 2009, kept it in her name initially, helped him get stable enough to take over the payments. When she finally paid off the mortgage in 2021, she put him on the deed as beneficiary because the house was his. It had always been meant to be his, but she'd needed to structure it carefully for tax reasons, her attorney had explained. Patrick Osei was her nephew, Elijah's younger son, 26 years old. The beneficiary wasn't a lover or a secret she was ashamed of. It was a kid she'd been quietly helping for years because he was family and he had nobody else. She wrote near the end, "I kept this from you for selfish reasons. I told myself it was to protect you, to keep things simple, to avoid having to explain a family that hurt me. But the truth is I was ashamed, not of Elijah, of myself, of how long I waited to find him, of the years that passed. I didn't want you to see that part of me." The last line was, "You deserved better than my silence. I'm sorry, my love." I sat at that kitchen table until 4 a.m. I don't know exactly when I stopped being angry. It wasn't a single moment. It was more like the way a fever breaks. You notice at some point that the heat is gone and you're just tired and wrung out and strangely relieved. I thought about my wife keeping a secret, this heavy for 16 years. I thought about what it must have weighed. I thought about her in that car on a February morning, alone, carrying all of that. And something in me just gave. I called Ms. Hargrove the next morning and asked for Patrick Osei's contact information. She said she would pass my number to him and let him make the choice to reach out. I said that was fine. He called 3 days later. His voice was young and careful, and he started the conversation by saying he understood if I was angry and that whatever I decided about the property, he wasn't going to fight me on it. He said his aunt had told him I was a good man, but that he understood if this was complicated. I asked him to tell me about himself. There was a pause. He said he was 26, working as an electrician's apprentice in Morgantown, had been clean for 3 years from an addiction that had cost him most of his early 20s, and that his Aunt Sylvia had shown up in his life right around the time he thought no one was going to. He said she used to call him on Sunday evenings. She'd ask about his week and tell him something funny that happened at the hospital and remind him that progress wasn't always loud. Sometimes it just looked like getting up. He said he found out she died the same way I did, a phone call he wasn't expecting. We talked for almost 2 hours, that first call. I'm not sure I can explain what it felt like, this young man on the other end of the line who had never met me, and yet who knew things about my wife I hadn't known. The way she laughed at herself when she made mistakes, the phrase she used when she was proud of someone. "You're doing the work," she'd say. "You're doing the work," she'd say. It felt like finding a door in a room I thought I knew completely. I drove to Morgantown in April. It's about 2.5 hours from Akron on a good day. I left early and stopped for coffee in a town called St. Missy, Claresville, and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes, thinking about what I was doing. I'm a structural engineer. I spent my career thinking about load-bearing capacity, about what structures can hold and what makes them fail. I sat in that parking lot and thought that sometimes the structures we trust most are the ones we've never bothered to inspect, not because we're careless, but because we never imagined they needed it. I was at his door by 10 in the morning. He looked like his aunt. That was the first thing I noticed. Something around the eyes, the way his expression settled when he was listening. He was tall, lean in the way young men who've come through difficulty often are, like they've burned through everything unnecessary. He shook my hand firmly and said he was glad I came. I said I was too, and I meant it. We sat on the porch of that little house for a long time. He showed me a photo of his father, Elijah, who had died 3 years earlier from heart disease. He showed me photos of Sylvia that I hadn't seen, her standing in the front yard of the house, squinting in the sun and laughing, holding a casserole dish with oven mitts that were clearly too small for her hands. That was Sylvia exactly. The oven mitts, the laugh, the casserole dish. I excused myself and went inside to the bathroom, and I stood at the sink and cried in a way I hadn't since the funeral. Not from grief exactly. Something different. Something closer to gratitude maybe, which I didn't expect. I thought about what Patrick had said on the phone. She showed up right when I thought no one was going to. I thought about all the years I'd watched my wife come home from nursing shifts with that particular tiredness she had, the kind that came from giving something real to people who needed it. I had always loved that about her. I just hadn't known how far it reached. We had lunch at a diner around the corner. Cheeseburgers and sweet tea and a slice of apple pie that Patrick said was the best in the county, which I agreed with for politeness, but also because it was genuinely very good. We talked about his work, his plans. He wanted to get his full journeyman's license by the end of the year. He had a girlfriend, a woman named Denise, who worked in healthcare administration. And he said she was the kind of person who made you want to be better because she already expected you to be. I thought, Sylvia would have loved hearing that. Before I left, he asked me something carefully, like he'd been holding it the whole afternoon. He asked whether I was going to contest the deed. He said again that he would understand. I told him no. I told him the house was his father's before him, in spirit if not in title, and that my wife had done exactly what she meant to do. I said I'd spent 2 months angry at a secret that turned out to be an act of love, and I was done being angry. I said that if he was willing, I'd like to stay in touch. Not because I felt obligated, but because he was the last person on earth who'd heard her voice on a Sunday evening, and that mattered to me. He nodded and looked away for a second, and then he said, "She told me about you, you know, more than once. She said you were the kind of man who paid for a stranger's gas and thought nothing of it." I had to laugh at that. After everything, that's what she'd remembered to tell him. I drove home as the sun was going down over the highway, the kind of Ohio evening that turns everything amber and flat and wide. I had the windows down even though it was still cool. And I thought about 31 years, and secrets and the things we carry alone because we think it protects the people we love. I thought about how Sylvia had driven this same highway dozens of times, alone, carrying this, and how she'd come home each time and made coffee with a half scoop extra and sat across from me at dinner and laughed at something I said. She was a whole person. That sounds obvious, but grief has a way of flattening people into loss, turning them into the shape of what's missing. Sitting in that car on the way home, I felt her come back into full dimension for the first time since February. The stubbornness and the warmth and the shame she'd never let me see, and the love she'd been giving quietly, steadily, to a nephew she found 16 years ago in Morgantown, West Virginia. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just grateful I'd gone. Grateful she'd written the letter. Grateful that a young man named Patrick answered the phone 3 days after I asked and spent 2 hours with a stranger telling him the things his wife never had. Gregory came to visit in May. I told him the whole story over dinner. He sat across from me the way his mother used to, with his elbows on the table, listening without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So she had a whole other family she was holding together." I said, "Yeah, she did." He said, "That sounds exactly like her." He was right. It sounded exactly like her. Patrick and I talk most Sundays now. Not every week, but most. Sometimes it's a long call. Sometimes it's a long call. Sometimes just 10 minutes. He tells me how the apprenticeship is going, what Denise thinks about his plan to eventually start his own shop. I tell him about my garden, which I started this spring because I needed somewhere to put my hands. Sylvia always wanted a vegetable garden, and I always said I didn't have the patience for it. Turns out I do. You just have to learn what things need before they're ready to show you anything. Last month, Patrick sent me a photo. It was the front porch of the house in Morgantown. Someone had planted flowers along the railing, small yellow ones I couldn't identify from the picture. He said Denise had done it. He said it was starting to look like a real home. I looked at that photo for a long time. I thought about the gas station in Akron in 1993, the card reader that didn't work. A woman in a white coat who told me absolutely not, and then gave me her number 4 days later. I thought about 31 years and what they actually hold when you stop pretending they were simple. They hold everything. The coffee with a half scoop extra, the Sunday phone calls I didn't know about, the oven mitts that were too small, the letter written with a steady hand. I didn't lose my wife on Route 77 in February. I lost one version of her, the one I thought I completely knew. What I found, eventually, in a manila folder and a 2.5-hour drive and a phone call from a 26-year-old who looked like her around the eyes, was the rest. And the rest was worth finding. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in any grand philosophical way. I'm an engineer, I think in systems, but in the quiet, practical sense of every outcome has a chain behind it. Every result traces back to decisions someone made, sometimes years before anyone felt the consequences. Sylvia made a decision in 2007. She found her brother, showed up at his door, and chose to help without telling me. That decision had a cost she paid privately for 16 years. And for a while, when I first learned about it, I thought her silence was the thing that mattered most. I thought the secret was the story. I was wrong. The secret was just the surface. The story was what she did underneath it. She found a family member who had nothing, and she quietly built a floor under him. No announcement, no credit, no one to tell her she was doing a good thing. She just drove to Morgantown and kept driving back year after year because she decided that's what you do when someone is yours and they're struggling. You show up. That's the whole philosophy. You show up. I think about the shame she mentioned in her letter. The shame of having waited so long to find Elijah, of the years that passed before she went looking. That shame was the reason for the silence, not dishonesty. She didn't hide it from me to protect a lie. She hid it because she hadn't forgiven herself yet, and she didn't know how to ask me to help carry something she hadn't made peace with. I understand that more than I expected to. I've had things I held too long for the same reason. What I've come to believe is this. The way a person handles their private failures says more about their character than almost anything else. Sylvia could have done nothing. She could have found Elijah, felt the guilt of the lost years, and walked away because it was easier. A lot of people would have. Instead, she turned that guilt into action. She made it useful. She let the shame become fuel for something decent. That takes a kind of intelligence that has nothing to do with what you know and everything to do with what you're willing to do with what you're willing to do with what you feel. Most people let difficult emotions stop them. She let hers move her forward. And then there's Patrick, 26 years old, 3 years out from an addiction that cost him most of his early 20s, building something real with his hands and his time, answering the phone when a stranger called, being honest about who he was and where he'd been. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. The willingness to be seen clearly, without the armor of a better story about yourself. That requires a kind of courage most people spend their whole lives avoiding. I drove home from Morgantown in the amber light of an April evening, and I thought, I have spent my career calculating what structures can hold, what loads they can bear before something gives. And I had applied almost none of that thinking to the people I loved. I assumed I knew what my wife was made of, because I had lived beside her for 31 years. I had never actually tested the assumption. She was stronger than I knew. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was the weight she chose to carry so I didn't have to, and she carried it all the way to the end without dropping it. I don't know if that was the right choice. I still think she should have told me. I think we could have done it together, and it would have been lighter for both of us, but I understand why she didn't. And understanding someone, really understanding them, is different from agreeing with them. It's harder, actually. It requires you to set down your own version of events long enough to hold theirs. That's what I'm still learning to do. At 58, with a vegetable garden I never thought I'd have patience for, and a phone call every Sunday that I look forward to more than I expected. Progress doesn't always look like what you thought it would. Sometimes it just looks like getting up. She told Patrick that. I think she meant it for herself too.